Oh, I'm on. I've been on all the time.
No.
Oh, that's all right then.
You're all right.
You wouldn't want to hear me singing, I can assure you.
No,
It would empty the church. So, today's sort of topic is love, but the strapline is, I just called to say I love you. Put in there. So I'm going to ask Justin if you could go in with Love Actually and then straight into the song. Thank you. So you need to pay attention.
Whenever I get gloomy with the state of the world, I think about the arrivals gate at Heathrow Airport. General opinion's starting to make out that we live in a world of hatred and greed. But I don't see that. Seems to me that love is everywhere. Often it's not particularly dignified or newsworthy, but it's always there. Fathers and sons, mothers and daughters, husbands and wives, boyfriends, girlfriends, old friends. When the planes hit the Twin Towers, as far as I know, none of the phone calls from the people on board were messages of hate or revenge. They were all messages of love. If you look for it, I've got a sneaky feeling you'll find that love actually is all around.
No New Year's Day to celebrate. No chocolate covered candy hearts to give away. No first of spring, no song to sing. In fact, here's just another ordinary day. No April rain, no flowers bloom, no wedding Saturday within the month of June. But what it is something true, made up of these three words that I must say to you. I just called to say I love you. I just called to say how much I care. I just called to say I love you, and I mean it from the bottom of my heart. No summer's high, no warm July, no harvest moon to light one tender August night. No autumn breeze, no falling leaves, not even time for birds to fly to southern sky. No Libra sun, no Halloween, no giving thanks to all the Christmas joy you bring. But what it is so oh so new, to fill your heart like no three words could ever
it's wonderful. But when we saw that clip from Love Actually, was there anything struck you? Well, quite clearly you weren't paying attention, were you? It was just a nice clip from Love Actually. The people who greeted each other, they were doing it out of love. Yeah. The signs, the cuddles, the mannerisms. There was no hate, I don't think I could see there. It was a demonstration of love. Wasn't it? Yeah. I believe. And when we look at this song by Stevie Wonder, which happens to be one of my favourites, as I said before, he says, I just called to say I love you. It was unconditional. There was nothing to celebrate specially. There were no presents. There was nothing. It was unconditional love. And every time I hear that song, it reminds me of unconditional love. And that's what our Lord Jesus has for us, which is unconditional love. And as I say, when we saw that clip from Love Actually, those people who were embracing, it was unconditional love. And I thought, well, actually, I couldn't resist showing those two extracts, if you like, because that leads us into what I'm going to talk to you about today, which is a much used chapter, if you want to call it that, from 1 Corinthians 13, where Paul is writing to the Corinthians, and I feel there is much to learn, because sometimes, forgive me, this can seem a bit sugary, but actually there is a very, very clear message in 1 Corinthians. So I'm going to read it to you now. If you've got your Bibles, feel free. And of course the title is Love. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains but have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames but have not love, I gain nothing. This is the bit I think we're all kind of familiar with. Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it is not rude, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, and always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilted. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when perfection comes, the imperfect disappears. Jesus, perfect here. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. Now we see but a poor reflection in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. I think it's talking about Jesus here. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these things remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. So, as I say, all familiar with that passage. And we'll all probably say, well, we've heard it a few times. So why was Paul, and I go back to Paul, we've heard a lot about him in this period of time, writing this to the church at Corinth? Well, do you know what? Paul had received information from several sources concerning conditions existing in that church. Paul was informed that factions had developed in the church. Yeah? And some of those who came to see Paul had brought disturbing information concerning moral irregularities in the church. See, Paul was so passionate. And Paul had written previously about concerning moral laxity. But this is something I think that Tony was talking about. You see, it says here, I believe Paul needed to clarify his instructions to his church and urge immediate and drastic action. I think Tony was saying that when we have people come into church, we need our message to be clear. People need to understand what we're about. And Paul reiterated this to the Corinthians. It's no good writing in gobbledygook, something that they wouldn't understand. Paul needed to make sure that this church in Corinth was in such a place that they understood what he was writing about. It would seem that other Corinthian visitors had brought a letter from the church that requested counsel on several subjects. So if you see in the previous parts of 1 Corinthians, there is counsel on other subjects, but I've chosen love. And one of which, as I said before, was love. So Paul, writing this letter out of love, was to instruct and restore the church in its area of weakness. One of its areas of weakness. He could see that this church in Corinth really wasn't doing things out of love. But equally importantly, Paul recognized that the Corinthians needed a sense of role and responsibility in the church. But they needed to be immersed in an attitude and ethos of love. Now, could that apply to us today? Could we actually find we need a sense of a role and responsibility? What are we responsible for? Who are we as a church? But we need to be immersed in attitudes of love. I think we need to rewind a little bit to understand why Paul was so passionate about writing to the church in Corinth. You see, we understand, or I think we kind of understand, if you want to look at it, this flowery view in some senses, although it wasn't flowery, the account of Paul's change before he came to know Jesus. So you see, Saul then, before Paul, the persecutor, was baptized and immediately began a new life as a man who would be known as Apostle Paul. You see, it was a total reversal of intention, though importantly not of his character. He was passionate. Whatever he did before was done out of love. And according to Paul and Saul's own words, recorded in Galatians 1:14, he says, I advanced in Judaism beyond many of my own age and among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the tradition of my fathers. So when Paul saw those traditions being threatened, he felt he had no choice but to try his best to stop them. So we know that Saul was a persecutor, but he was so ardent in his belief. But amazingly, when he had this experience, if you want to call it that, he was still unstinting. His service to God was absolutely paramount. And his understanding meant that he had to change. But he didn't diminish his passion. He didn't diminish his desire to spread the word of what God was saying. I think that's important because, as I said before, when he writes these letters, they're not wishy-washy. So where are we at? So Paul selects 4 gifts as example, and I believe you're going to do fruit of the Spirit later, is that right? Have I got that?
We're doing fruitfulness in Scotland.
Right, thank you very much. So watch this space. I think this kind of links in a little bit, Adam.
That's why I'm scribbling notes, Angela.
So Paul selects 4 gifts as examples in this passage. But what does Paul say? What does he say? What he's saying is that even the most spectacular manifestations of these gifts mean nothing, absolutely nothing, unless motivated by love. Does that ring any bells? It does to me. You know, we can do things. Hello, we've got something in the back row there going on. Can you hear me? Can you hear? That's right. Sorry, it's my way of doing things. I look around and see things going on. No, where were we? Unless motivated by love. So it's very difficult, isn't it? You know, as a churches, I'm using plural here, we can give, we can do, but, as Paul is writing to the church in Corinth, unless it's motivated by love, it doesn't mean too much. Paul says, even if he could speak not only the various languages that human beings speak, and if he used the angels of the language of angels, if he didn't speak in love, it would be nothing but noise. Now, when we worship on a Sunday morning, do we worship in love, or are we making a noise? Now, the worship we had earlier on was absolutely wonderful, and I would challenge anybody that you didn't feel a sense of love of Jesus. But what Paul is saying, whatever we do, we need to do it out of love. Importantly too, though, in this letter, I think underpinning this, I think what Paul is saying is that the church should demonstrate a selfless concern for the welfare of others. See, interestingly enough, it's not demonstrated by the quality of lovableness. We can look all lovey-dovey, but is a product of a will to love in obedience of God's command. God's command to love. Now that can be tough. Absolutely, really, really tough to love. When inside you're thinking, oh, flipping ding-dongs. You know, but this is what Paul is saying to this church in Corinth. And one could argue to churches that we know and others. So Paul wasn't silly when he was citing gifts that the church in Corinth, and us, I hope, would understand. He's saying it as it is. He's saying it in the language that the church in Corinth would understand. So Paul cites other characteristics. A gift of unlimited knowledge. Then if we do not exercise that gift in love, then it is nothing. And I think Paul makes no apology for labouring the point. He had to get the point across to this church in Corinth, who were in a terrible, terrible mess. And he had to keep saying it and saying it and saying it. One of the quite controversial bits in this passage, and I find this quite difficult, there's a reference made to a martyrdom by burning at the stake. I can't remember which verse in, if someone's there before me.
Verse 3.
Verse 3, isn't it? Where am I?
I give my possessions to the poor and surrender my body to the flames.
Flames, that's right, Matthew. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. Now that is quite a strong statement, because what Paul seems to suggest, that even this supreme sacrifice, if not motivated by love, accomplishes nothing. Now, can you imagine that? Can you imagine that? I can't. I find that very difficult to get to grips with. You know, if you saw one of the Christian martyrs, we assume it's by love. Only God knows that. And this is a very forceful statement. Quite clearly, he was wanting to shock this church. He was wanting to say, come on. So clearly, the church must have been in a dodgy state. Now, of course, we're not in a dodgy state, are we? No. Have you said that out of love or not? Interesting, isn't it? So if you like, Paul was giving this church a real telling off. Come on, Corinth, pull up your socks. And if we look in verses 4 to 7, love of this chapter, love is described here both positively and negatively. Matthew, do you want... Oh, sorry, you haven't got your phone there. I was going to ask you. It says, love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it is not rude, it is not self-seeking, it is not easily angered, it keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices in the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. So for us as a church and as people doing things out of love, it always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. And for us as Christians, as a church, perseverance can be blooming difficult at times. How many times have you asked a mate, say, well, you know, it'd be really nice if you would come to church on Sunday, or you've tried to tell them about Jesus, and there can be a massive sense of frustration. And think, how many times am I going to go over and over and over this, when actually, to me, it's as plain as anything. But you have to continue out of love. You have to carry on. And for us as a church, I think that is so important. Moving on, though, very, very importantly, in verses 8 to 12, I don't know about you, but I think Paul is referring to Christ's second coming in that. Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilted. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when perfection comes, the imperfect disappears. When perfection comes, the imperfect disappears. So I feel, well, my view is here, you may disagree with me, that Paul here is referring to Christ's second coming. It's only then that the Christians, etc., will know God to their fullest extent. And I think Paul is saying all of this won't be right until the Lord comes again. So, I'm just looking at the time. So what does all this mean to us today? How does this letter apply? Well, I've indicated a little bit when I've been talking to you. So we know this passage is about love, but it's about us doing things in love. We are commanded to love God, Matthew 22:37, and love one another, John 13:34. We can talk all we want about Christian love, but what is the reality here? How do we at this church actually do love. See, because I think perhaps Paul is also implying that human love is flawed. Only God's love is perfect. So us as a church, what activities do we have? What things do we do that need to be done in love? And my argument would mean everything. Everything. Whether it's moving the chairs that are really heavy, going on the car park when we had the baptism last week, whatever it might be. And that's a tough call. I'm not sure I can stand up to it, but it is a real tough call. So I'm not going to say too much more, but can I come out will you see me if I go out the front there, like this?
Yeah.
Does anybody know what that is? Love lies bleeding, yes. Dad used to grow that quite a lot when we lived in Haynes. It's a beautiful plant, but it's quite sad. Yeah. Love lies bleeding. And we are in a world today where I personally think love lies bleeding all over the place. If love and things were done out of true love, then perhaps we wouldn't have so much love lying bleeding. Sorry, it's a challenge, guys. And also, how are we here in this church? Are we like that plant? Does our love lie bleeding? Margaret was saying earlier on, it was quite profound really, when she was talking about being too comfortable. So my prayer for this church and today is that we aren't too comfortable and that our love doesn't lie bleeding, and that we will heed the message of Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Thank you, Matthew.